Hey guys, Tosin here with another Hunter Guide. This one is about choosing the right pet. So, I get a lot of questions about what pet you use and what you spec them as, cunning or ferocity and whatever. So, this guide should clarify what types of pets you should have in your arsenal and how you should spec them. Alright, so first off, let me tell you the four pets that you should pretty much have by default, in my opinion. I like to have two cranes or monkeys. They're pretty much the same. There's slight differences between them. The crane casts faster with its lullaby. It doesn't have a cast time. The monkey stun is a half-second cast, so it can get a little glitchy with the AI. Sometimes the target you're trying to monkey stun behind a pillar will go back and forth behind a pillar and it'll cancel the monkey's cast over and over. And so it can make it seem like the monkey's being very disobedient. So I typically don't like to use monkeys, but sometimes I keep an extra one just in case because the difference is the strength of the monkey stun is that it cannot be broken with Will of the Forsaken or Tremor Totem like the Lullaby stun can. Lullaby and monkey stun are identical except that the Lullaby is asleep, which means Tremor Totem and Will of the Forsaken racial can break it, so that's the only disadvantage. Typically for non-Beast Mastery specs, if I'm playing Marks or Survival, and I typically prefer Survival right now, I will run two cranes or monkeys, typically cranes though, and then two foxes or goats. They're pretty much the same thing, so it doesn't really matter which one you use. So I will run two of each. Two cranes, two goats, let's say. And then the fifth pet doesn't really matter. You can kind of have whatever variety pet you want. Now, the reason this is important to me is because you fight various comps, and sometimes you want to have different specs for each pet. So sometimes you want a ferocity goat, and sometimes you want a cunning goat for the Roar of Sac. And likewise with a crane, sometimes you want a ferocity crane and sometimes you want a cunning crane. So that's why I like to have two of each. And the fifth pet, like I said, doesn't really matter. You can kind of put whatever flavor pet you want in there for situational things, but I usually don't use anything but those two kinds of pets anyway. So as non-BM specs, you basically want two cranes or monkeys, depending on your preference, one of cunning and ferocity, and then two goats or foxes, one of cunning and ferocity, and the fifth pet doesn't matter. Now, for Beast Mastery, you can also use cranes or monkeys if you want, or you can use a shale spider. Shale spider is good. It's better in most ways. The only downside is having a 1 second less stun makes it harder to trap off of, because a lot of the time people will lag when you stun them with a pet, and getting that extra second to land a trap is really helpful in a lot of situations. However, it's mostly personal preference, and it's not going to make or break your gameplay. So, same exact thing for BM is two shale spiders or whatever kind of stun pet you want of each spec, and then two foxes or goats of each spec, and then your fifth pet, I usually use a Devilsaur because a lot of the time having the 5% crit chance and the automatic healing debuff in a lot of situations is very handy, whether it be certain dueling situations, BGs, so you don't have to cast Widow Venom because that's really annoying, or even in arena matches where if you don't have if you're not playing like with a melee partner that has a healing debuff, like a warrior, a monk, or a rogue or something, and if you're playing like with an enhancement shaman or something that doesn't have Immortal Strike, it's nice to have that healing debuff automatically applied. It'll save you a lot of global cooldowns. So I definitely recommend having that if you're BM. It's a very handy pet to have. Now, when it comes to choosing the right pets for each situation, that's what I'm going to get into next. You now know which pets that I recommend just to have in your arsenal, so now let me show you the areas where you would change these pets. Alright, so here's an example. I'm playing Survival, and I'm fighting a Wizard Cleave. There are three caster classes on this team. The healer and the two DPS are all casters. So, against caster teams like this, I usually prefer to use a Ferocity Spec Goat. Now, you will almost always use a Ferocity Spec Goat, but I will tell you why later why I think having a Cunning Spec Goat is important as well. So, here we are facing this Wizard Cleave, and having an AoE casting speed reduction pet is insanely useful. And even if I was Beast Mastery, I'd probably use a goat because I wouldn't need the Devilsaur because my rogue applies a healing debuff already. So this is what I'm using here. And now you might think, why not use a crane for the stun? Well, I'm playing with a rogue, and a lot of the time my rogue will redirect Kidney Shot or Vanish Cheap Shot the healer for me to trap off of. So a lot of the time it's really easy to waste that 2-minute cooldown crane stun because a lot of the time your rogue might diminish it and you won't realize it. So it's really a clear choice against a Wizard Cleave for me to almost always use a fox or a goat to slow down their casting speed. Now, you might be thinking, when would you use the cunning version of the goat against a wizard comp? Well, first off, the reason you use a ferocity most of the time is obviously for the free pet res. If they kill it, you can resurrect it with Heart of the Phoenix for free. That's the only reason you would ever use a ferocity pet, is if you think that they might kill your pet. And wizard cleaves are very good at killing pets. So if they want to play the scumbag way and kill your pet, it's nice to have a backup res for it. So that's why I usually run a ferocity goat. Now, this is a fire mage, so if we lost to this team and had a lot of trouble against them, dying in deep freezes, what fire mages typically do, I'd probably bust out the cunning pet. So it kind of depends on what you're fighting. Fire mages, if you understand how fire mages work, if you've fought them before, you know how they work. They pretty much deep freeze you and shoot a million pyroblasts into you that crit, 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 and blow you up. A lot of the time you will die from 100% to dead in that deep freeze if you don't trinket the deep freeze or get out of it in some way, or have some help from teammates. However, if you have a cunning spec pet, then you have Roar of Sacrifice, which will make you or a chosen teammate immune to critical strikes. This completely counters the Fire Mage burst sequence. So, against a Fire Mage, had we lost to this team, because the mage blew somebody up in a deep freeze, I would have definitely said, screw this, I'm using a cunning goat next time. That way, every time he lands a deep freeze, I can make his target immune to critical strikes and pretty much guarantee they survive the deep freeze. So that's when I would use a cunning goat. If I'm fighting a fire mage, pretty much. I usually won't use it against a frost mage, but it's not a bad idea. It just sort of depends. The problem with Roar of Sacrifice is if you use it against like a frost mage and he drops a frozen orb, whenever you use Roar of Sacrifice, your pet takes damage. 20% of the damage that the target receives is duplicated to the pet. It's not transferred, so your pet isn't absorbing the damage, it's just taking extra damage. And a lot of the time, that damage alone can kill your pet. But if there is a frozen orb AoEing your pet as well, it's even more likely to die. So using a cunning pet against a frost mage is very risky because your pet can die after using Roar of Sacrifice if your healer can't heal it, and then you'll have to try to res that pet, and a good team will stop you from resing a pet a lot of the time. So it's really annoying to use a cunning pet against frost mages in my opinion, although it's not necessarily a bad idea. It just depends on how good your healer is at keeping it up. So generally speaking, I use ferocity pets with a cast speed slow, like a fox or a goat, against wizard cleaves. But if it's a fire mage and I'm scared of us getting globaled in a deep freeze, I will use the cunning version to protect us from crits in those situations. That is how you choose your pets against those kinds of comps. Now, whenever I'm fighting a comp like this, where it has a melee DPS and a caster DPS, it's a tough choice. It's like, well, the goat would be really nice against a warlock and a little bit against the shaman as well to slow his casts, but it doesn't do much to the feral. So against comps like this, I usually don't use the cast speed slow. This is something you kind of feel out against certain comps. Sometimes you'll think it's worth it. Maybe if you're playing with a different melee class that can't stop casts nearly as much. But see, I'm playing with a rogue, and the rogue puts mind numbing on the warlock for me. So he has mind numbing on the warlock, and the feral druid doesn't really cast. So having the spell casting slow doesn't really affect the feral that much. So it's a really easy choice for me in this situation to use the monkey or the crane. So in this case, I chose the monkey, and I didn't choose ferocity spec because this comp is not going to do a lot of spread damage besides the warlock. Usually wizard cleaves are the ones that are most likely to kill your pet easily, so I'm not worried about them killing my pet as this comp, and so I don't need the ferocity spec for the extra res. Instead, I'd rather have crit reduction because, as you can see, feral druids crit a lot, so having crit immunity against a feral druid can mitigate a lot of damage. So cunning is definitely the right choice against this comp for the reasons that I have stated. So just to recap, this is the logic. What does cunning do? Cunning gives you crit immunity, and ferocity gives you a free pet res. And then you have to choose the type of pet. Spellcast slow goat, or a fox or something, or a stun pet. Well, to me, the extra stun CC is more valuable than the cast speed slow because my rogue already slows the warlock's casts, and it doesn't really affect the feral druid. So the choice is pretty easy here. This is the logic that I use to decide what pet I'm going to use before the gates open. Now, when it comes to fighting hunter cleaves or any melee cleave in the game, I will always use a cunning spec stun pet, or if I'm BM, sometimes I will use the Devilsaur. But it will always be cunning no matter what kind of pet I'm using. In this case, I'm playing BM, so I'm using a Devilsaur for the healing debuff because I have a Ret on my team and I don't want to have to constantly apply Widow Venom. But if I was Survival or Marksman, I would be using a stun pet. So against cleave comps, all of these classes are very dependent on critical strikes to deal a lot of their damage. So, Roar of Sacrifice is insanely useful against Rets, Hunters, Rogues, Warriors, Ferals, Enhancement Shamans, etc. Roar of Sacrifice is good against pretty much any physical or like Hunters or any melee class for the most part. So, the only melee class that Roar of Sacrifice is really weak against is Death Knights. Well, not even Frost Death Knights. I think it's pretty good against Frost still. I'm not 100% sure. I'll have to double check. I think they crit a lot, but I know on Holy Death Knights, Cunning Pets are worthless because they don't crit a lot. So, as far as choosing your pet against cleave comps, always go with the Cunning Pet. It will mitigate a ton of damage if you use it at the right times, and you don't really have to worry too much about your pet dying. So, I think I've given you a pretty good idea of when you should use each type of pet. There are some variations that you can feel out yourself from experience. If you fight a comp a lot of the time, and let's say you're playing Thug Cleave or something like that, and you're fighting some Wizard Cleave comp, or maybe you're playing KFC and you fight a Wizard Cleave comp. Now, a lot of the time you'll want the cast speed reduction, but a warrior doesn't provide that many stuns, typically, so having the extra stun won't really collide with diminishing returns if you use it right. And a lot of the time that extra CC can easily help you land a kill early. So if you're playing KFC and KFC is strong at the time, the Fox or the Goat are really good against Wizard Cleaves if the fight happens to last a good 2 to 3 minutes or longer. However, if you are consistently just destroying a team like in under 2 minutes, a lot of the time you don't really need the cast speed reduction because you're keeping them pressured so hard as it is that it doesn't really matter. So that's stuff that you can kind of feel out, and it changes based on comp strength and how you're running a comp. But I hope this video has given you a general idea of what kind of pets you should have in your arsenal and when you should use each type of pet and which spec you should have it at any given time. The one thing that I want to say is against Death Knights, unless they're playing with a very crit-dependent teammate like a Rogue, then I would suggest never using a Cunning Pet against Unholy Death Knights, because Unholy Death Knights don't ever crit, well, they almost never crit, so it doesn't really help against them, and they'll also spread a lot of damage to your pet and make it more likely to die just with the spread dot damage, so having a Ferocity pet for the free Resurrect is very good to have. For instance, if you're fighting Shadow Cleave, which is Warlock Death Knight, usually an Unholy Death Knight, if you're fighting Shadow Cleave, it's a good idea to use a Ferocity pet. Now, whether or not you use a stun pet or a cast speed slow pet sort of depends on what kind of comp you're playing. Anyway, guys, that concludes this video on choosing the right pet as a hunter. So, I hope this video has been very informative, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching as usual, and peace out.